So, I got something super cool for you today, Anna. It's, well, not exactly cool in the traditional sense, but definitely fascinating.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What are we diving into on Mic'd In today?
Before we get into it, I wanted to remind our viewers to hit that like button and subscribe as we're going to talk about Ted Bundy, who is like the poster boy for serial killers. And what makes him so interesting is that he had almost everything going for him, you know? Good looks, charm, intelligence, ambition.
Wait, really? That doesn't sound like what you'd expect from a serial killer at all.
Exactly. That's what makes him so terrifying. He could have been anything he wanted to be, a lawyer, politician, whatever. Instead, he became one of the most notorious killers in American history, murdering as many as 40 women and girls during a 4-year rampage in the mid-70s.
Oh my god, that's horrific. How did someone who seemed so normal on the outside commit such terrible crimes?
That's the million-dollar question, right? He was so mainstream that the Washington State Republican Party actually hired him. He was so, cunning that he escaped from jail twice, and women were even sending him marriage proposals while he was on death row. Like, can you believe that?
That's absolutely wild. So what do we think drove him to do these horrible things?
Well, that's what we're going to explore today. We'll look at his childhood, his relationships, and try to understand the psychological factors that might have turned this seemingly normal guy into, well, a monster. There had to be something beneath the surface. You know what I mean?
So let's start with his background. What kind of childhood did Ted Bundy have? Was there anything in his early life that might explain, how he became who he was?
So, Bundy was born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, and his early life was, complicated to say the least. He was actually born Theodore Robert Cowell to a young unmarried woman named Eleanor Louise Cowell. She was only 22 when she had him, and the father wanted absolutely nothing to do with him.
Oh, that must have been tough, especially back in the 40s when being a single mom was so stigmatized.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Because of that stigma, when Eleanor moved back to Philadelphia to live with her parents, they came up with this bizarre family arrangement. They decided to raise Ted as their own son, to avoid the whole illegitimate child scandal.
Wait, so Ted grew up thinking his mother was actually his sister?
Yes, exactly that. He grew up believing his grandmother was his mother, and that his actual mother was his older sister. Can you imagine finding out something like that later in life? It's gotta mess with your sense of identity.
That's completely wild. When did he find out the truth?
Well, he didn't find out until he was in his early 20s. After a breakup with his first serious girlfriend, we'll talk about her in a bit, he visited Vermont and looked up his birth records. That's when he discovered this bombshell that his sister was actually his mother. Talk about psychological trauma, right?
I can't even imagine. So what happened after that early childhood deception?
In 1950, Eleanor, or Louise as she started calling herself, moved with Ted to Tacoma, Washington. They changed their names, and a year later, she married a cook named Johnny Bundy. That's where the name Ted Bundy comes from.
Did he have a good relationship with his stepfather?
Not really. By all accounts, Ted never bonded with Johnny. He actually, considered himself a Cowell rather than a Bundy, and his adolescent years were described as pretty unhappy. He was shy and got bullied a lot.
And his education? You mentioned earlier he could have been anything he wanted.
Right. He was genuinely smart. He graduated high school in 1965, got a scholarship to the University of Puget Sound, then transferred to the University of Washington where he studied psychology. He was actually working toward law school at one point, and even worked for the Republican Party in Washington state. He really did have, a promising future ahead of him.
So there was no obvious sign he would become a killer?
That's what makes him so frightening. There were no giant red flags, just a bright, charming guy who seemed destined for success. But underneath, something was very, very wrong.
So what about this first girlfriend you mentioned? Stephanie Brooks, right? What was their relationship like?
Yeah, Stephanie Brooks. This relationship it's actually super important to understanding Bundy's psychology. He met her in 1967 at the University of Washington and just fell completely head over heels for her. And I mean, she was this beautiful, sophisticated woman, tall, slender, with long brown hair parted in the middle.
Was she his first serious relationship?
Yes. According to Anne Rule, who wrote that famous book about Bundy called The Stranger Beside Me, this was actually the first time he'd had any kind of sexual relationship. So it was really significant for him.
So what happened between them?
Well, things seemed to be going great for a while. But then in 1968, after Stephanie graduated, she broke it off with him. She told him that he had no real direction, no ambition, and she wasn't ready to commit. And this just absolutely devastated him.
I can see how that would hurt, but lots of people get dumped without turning into killers.
Exactly. But for Bundy, this rejection was apparently catastrophic. After the breakup, he couldn't focus on anything. His grades tanked so badly that he dropped out of college. And here's where it gets really interesting. Almost all of his early victims physically resembled Stephanie. They were tall, slender young women with long brown hair parted in the middle. It's like he was symbolically killing her over and over.
Oh my God, that's chilling. So you think her rejection was actually what triggered his killing spree?
Well, we can't say for sure, but the connection is pretty hard to ignore, and there's more to the story that makes it even more twisted. See, after the breakup and after discovering the truth about his birth, Bundy went back to the University of Washington and just transformed himself. He became this super ambitious, politically active guy, totally reinventing himself.
To win her back?
That seems to have been the plan. And it worked. In 1973, after he'd gotten his life on track and was working for the Republican Party, he reconnected with Stephanie. She was really impressed with the new Ted, and they started dating again. They even talked about marriage.
But I'm guessing this wasn't actually a happy reunion.
Not at all. Just a few months into their rekindled relationship, he just ghosted her. Completely cut her off without explanation, just like she had done to him years earlier. It was his revenge.
That's so calculated and cold.
It is. And here's the most disturbing part. His first known murder attempt happened just 3 days after New Year's in 1974, right around the time he dumped Stephanie. It's like once he'd gotten his revenge on her, he started acting out his rage on these other women who looked like her.
That's genuinely terrifying. The idea that rejection could lead to that kind of violence.
Yeah, and that's what makes Bundy so fascinating and horrifying. There was this perfect storm of psychological factors. His confusion about his identity, his rejection by Stephanie, his ambition and charm that let him get close to victims. It all came together to create one of the most dangerous predators in American history.
So after getting his revenge on Stephanie, Bundy just started killing? How did it all begin?
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing how quickly he escalated. His first known victim was Joni Lentz, an 18-year-old in Seattle. On January 4th, 1974, he broke into her house and, assaulted her brutally. He actually, and this is really hard to talk about, but he broke off a bedrod and used it to assault her.
Oh my God, did she survive?
She did, miraculously. Her roommates found her unconscious in a pool of blood, but she was still breathing. But then, just a few weeks later, on January 31st, he attacked 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, a weather forecaster and law student at the University of Washington. She wasn't as lucky. She completely vanished from her basement bedroom, and all that was left behind were blood-stained sheets.
That's absolutely terrifying. So he was targeting women in Seattle at first?
At first, yeah, but he didn't stay in one place for long. What made Bundy so dangerous was how mobile he was. Over the next few months in 1974, 7 more women disappeared across Washington, Utah, and Oregon. All with the same pattern, all young, slender women with long brown hair parted in the middle.
Was there anything connecting these disappearances? I mean, how was he finding these victims?
This is where Bundy was really calculating. He had this technique, right? He'd approach women in public places, often wearing a fake cast on his arm or leg, and he'd ask for help carrying something to his car.
He'd pretend to be injured to seem harmless?
Exactly. And, in the 70s, people were generally more trusting. He'd use his charm and this fake vulnerability to get women to let their guard down. Several witnesses later reported being approached by this handsome guy with a cast who called himself Ted.
And nobody suspected anything?
Not at first. I mean, he was this good-looking, well-spoken guy who seemed completely normal. It wasn't until bodies started being discovered that police realized they were dealing with a serial killer. In August 1974, the remains of Denise Naslund and Janice Ott were found near Lake Sammamish in Washington, just 4 miles apart.
Wait, Lake Sammamish, wasn't that where...
Yes, that was actually a turning point in the case. On July 14th, then, Bundy approached several women at Lake Sammamish State Park, asking for help with his sailboat while wearing a cast. Some refused, but unfortunately, both Janice Ott and Denise Naslund agreed to help him. They were never seen alive again.
Did he kill them the same day?
He later confessed that he did. And what's really chilling is that he kept Ott alive long enough to witness him bringing Naslund to the same location hours later. It was just incredibly sadistic.
That's absolutely horrific. How many women did he actually kill during this period?
It's hard to know the exact number. By the time investigators in Washington, Oregon, and Utah started comparing notes and realizing they were looking for the same man, the body count was already staggering, and his victims kept turning up in remote locations, especially in the Taylor Mountains, which eventually became known as his personal graveyard.
So what finally led to Bundy's capture? I mean, with all those murders across different states, someone must have eventually caught on to him.
Yeah, so The first real break happened on November 8, 1974, in Salt Lake City. Bundy tried to abduct this 18-year-old woman named Carol Duranch from a mall, but she fought back and managed to escape from his car, and that was like a crucial mistake on his part, because she could actually identify him.
Thank goodness she escaped. What happened?
So Duranch gave police a description of both the man and his VW bug. And, the same night as her escape, a 17-year-old girl named Debbie Kent disappeared from a high school in nearby Bountiful. Someone saw a tan Volkswagen speeding away from the parking lot. But, it wasn't until August 16th, 1975 that they actually caught him.
What happened?
Well, this highway patrolman in Granger, Utah spotted an unfamiliar VW bug and got suspicious. When he tried to check the plate, Bundy, he just sped off. After a short chase, they pulled him over and searched his car. And what they found was basically a murder kit. Handcuffs, rope, a crowbar, ski mask, ice pick, even a nylon stocking.
Wow, that's like the definition of incriminating evidence.
Right? And when they brought in Carol Duranch, she immediately identified him in a lineup. They charged him with attempted kidnapping, and in February 1976, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. But the thing is, they knew he was responsible for so much more.
So they had him in custody. How did he manage to escape?
This is where his intelligence and his charisma really came into play. While he was in jail, Colorado charged him with the murder of Corinne Campbell, whose body had been found in 1975. So they transferred him to the Garfield County Jail in Colorado to await trial.
And he somehow got out?
Twice! The first time, in June 1977, he was granted permission to use the courthouse library in Aspen to research his case. He was representing himself, by the way. When no one was looking, he just jumped out a second-story window and walked away.
No way. That seems so, I don't know, simple.
It was. And that's what made Bundy so dangerous. He knew how to manipulate the system. They recaptured him after 8 days, but then, on December 30th, 1977, he escaped again. And this time it was even more elaborate.
What did he do?
So he'd been starving himself, lost about 30 pounds, and he managed to squeeze through a small light fixture hole in the ceiling of his cell. Then he crawled through this space above the ceiling, made his way into his jailer's apartment, and just walked out the front door. It took them 15 hours to realize he was gone.
That's absolutely wild. Where did he go?
He made his way to Chicago and then flew to Florida. And that's when things got really, really dark. He rented an apartment near Florida State University, grew a beard, used a fake name, Chris Hagen. But he couldn't. He couldn't control his urges. He completely lost whatever small amount of control he might have had left. On the night of Saturday, January 14th, 1978, he did something just absolutely horrific.
I'm almost afraid to ask what happened next.
He broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University and attacked 4 co-eds while they were sleeping. His method was terrifying. He would sneak into each victim's room and just knock them unconscious one by one.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. 2 of the young women suffered such severe injuries that they died, while the other 2 somehow survived the brutal attack. And the forensic details are they're honestly stomach-turning. The pathologist who did the autopsies found that one of the women had been beaten with a club, raped, and strangled. There were even bite marks on her body.
Bite marks? That seems like a really risky thing to do, forensically speaking.
Exactly. And those bite marks would eventually become crucial evidence against him. But what's really disturbing is that she had also been sexually assaulted with a metal hairspray can. The other victim who died had been beaten with the same club and strangled as well.
This feels like such an escalation from his previous crimes. Like the violence seems so much more intense.
It absolutely was. The psychologists who've studied Bundy believe that by this point he was completely unraveling. And what's really terrifying is that he wasn't done. Less than a month later, on February 9th, he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach.
12? That's just a child.
I know. She's the youngest victim we know of. Her parents reported her missing immediately, and police launched this extensive search, but they couldn't find her. Her remains weren't discovered until weeks later, after Bundy had already been caught.
How was he finally caught for good?
So just 6 days after Kimberly disappeared, a Pensacola police officer was patrolling a residential area when he noticed a man in an orange VW Bug who seemed to be casing the neighborhood. The officer ran a check on the plates and found out they were stolen.
So it wasn't even his murders that got him caught, but a routine traffic stop?
Right. It's often the small things that trip up even the most careful criminals. When the officer tried to arrest him, Bundy actually put up a fight. He attempted to run away, and the officer fired a warning shot. Bundy fell down but then jumped back up and attacked the officer. There was a struggle, but the officer finally managed to subdue and handcuff him.
And did they connect him to the Chi Omega murders immediately?
Well, once they identified him as Theodore Bundy, Florida investigators ordered impressions of his teeth to compare with those bite marks I mentioned from the Chi Omega victim, and the match was indisputable. That evidence basically sealed his fate.
It's just so chilling to think about how quickly he escalated after escaping. 3 murders and multiple assaults in just over a month.
Yeah, and who knows how many more would have died if that officer hadn't spotted him that night. When you look at the timeline of his crimes in Florida, it's clear he was accelerating. The violence was getting worse. The cooling off period between attacks was getting shorter. He was completely out of control.
So after they caught him in Florida, what happened next? I mean, with the bite mark evidence, did the trial move quickly?
Oh, not at all. The justice system, even with someone like Bundy, it still moves pretty slowly. His trial for the Chi Omega murders didn't actually start until July 1979, over a year after his capture.
That seems like a long time to wait.
It is, but what's really interesting is how Bundy behaved during this whole period. See, he decided to act as his own attorney, which, there's that old saying about having a fool for a client. But Bundy was so narcissistic and so confident in his abilities that he thought he could outsmart everyone in the courtroom.
Wait, they actually let him defend himself in a murder trial?
Yeah, and it was actually quite the spectacle. He would strut around the courtroom like he owned the place. He'd cross-examine witnesses, make objections, the whole thing. And he actually wasn't terrible at it, which is pretty disturbing when you think about it.
I can't even imagine how the victims' families felt watching that.
Right? It must have been absolutely torturous. But the thing is, even though Bundy thought he was being clever, the evidence against him was just overwhelming. Those bite marks I mentioned, they were basically like a dental fingerprint linking him directly to the crime scene. The prosecution brought in odontology experts who testified that the bite marks on one of the Chi Omega victims matched Bundy's teeth perfectly.
That seems like pretty definitive evidence.
It was. And on July 23, 1980, after all his theatrics and delay tactics, the jury found him guilty on 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to die in Florida's electric chair.
Did he react to the verdict?
You know what's really chilling? He barely reacted at all, just stone-faced. And then later, they tried him separately for the murder of Kimberly Leach, that 12-year-old girl, and he was convicted and sentenced to death for that crime too.
But he still maintained control somehow, right? I mean, he wasn't executed right away.
No, not at all. He managed to delay his execution for nearly 10 years through appeals. And this is where his manipulation really comes through. While on death row, he actually received, get this, marriage proposals from women. Actual women who wanted to marry him, knowing full well what he'd done.
I don't even know what to say to that.
I know, it's beyond comprehension. But Bundy had this ability to project this charm, this normal, likable persona that somehow transcended even his horrible crimes. He even managed to father a child while on death row with one of his admirers who would visit him.
Seriously? How is that even possible?
They say he bribed the guards. The whole thing just shows how he never really lost that sense of control, that ability to manipulate the system and the people around him, even when he was literally waiting to die.
So after nearly 10 years of appeals, he was finally executed, right? What happened in those final days?
Yeah, he was executed on January 24th, 1989. And what's really interesting about those final days is that Bundy finally started confessing. After years and years of denials and playing games with investigators, he suddenly wanted to talk.
Why the change of heart?
Well, I think he realized his time was really up. No more appeals, no more delays. And Bundy, being Bundy, he wanted to maintain some control over the narrative until the very end. So he started offering information about his crimes in exchange for delaying his execution date.
Classic manipulation.
Exactly. It was just one last attempt to control the situation. But what's really chilling is that in his final interview with Dr. James Dobson, he confessed to a total of 40 murders. Though, many investigators believe the actual number could be much higher.
Did he show any remorse at all?
Not in any meaningful way. He was more clinical about it. But he did leave us with this absolutely bone-chilling quote. He said, "We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere. And there will be more of your children dead tomorrow."
Oh my God, that's terrifying.
It really is. And you know what? That's actually what makes Bundy so important in the history of how we understand serial killers. He completely shattered the stereotype of what a murderer looks like. He wasn't some creepy loner or obviously disturbed person. He was handsome, articulate, educated. He worked in politics, for crying out loud.
It's the scariest thing about him, isn't it? That he could be anyone.
Absolutely. And his case really revolutionized criminal profiling. The FBI's behavioral science unit actually studied him extensively to understand how someone so seemingly normal could commit such horrific crimes. And, after his execution, in this really bizarre final chapter, his remains were cremated and scattered over the same Washington mountains where he dumped so many of his victims.
That's just wrong on so many levels.
I know, it's like even in death, he found a way to insert himself into their story one last time. And that's why, decades later, we're still talking about him. He's become this cautionary tale about how evil can hide behind the most charming smile.
So, looking back at the whole Ted Bundy saga, what do you think it is that makes him stand out so much in the annals of crime history?
I think it's the complete contradiction of who he appeared to be versus what he actually was. Like, this wasn't just someone who could blend in, right? He was someone who could actually excel in normal society. He was, charming, good-looking, intelligent. And yet beneath all that was this absolute monster.
It's almost like he was wearing the perfect mask.
Exactly. And that's what makes him so terrifying. Because if Ted Bundy could be a serial killer, then, well, anyone could be. Your classmate, your coworker, even your boyfriend. He completely changed how we think about predators. They're not always, hiding in the shadows or looking suspicious.
Do you think that's why his case has had such a lasting impact on popular culture? I mean, there have been so many books, documentaries, movies about him.
Oh, absolutely. His case didn't just fascinate the public. It actually changed how law enforcement operates. The way they profile serial offenders now, the way they look for patterns and psychological indicators. A lot of that development can be traced back to what they learned studying Bundy.
And I guess that's the silver lining, if there can be one in such a horrific case. At least we've learned something that might help catch future predators.
Yeah, and that's really important because, that's probably the best way to honor his victims, by making sure that what happened to them helps protect others.
Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this episode of Mic'd In. This was a difficult topic, but an important one. If you enjoyed our episode, hit those subscribe and like buttons and stay tuned for more. Until then, take care of yourselves and maybe double check your locks tonight.